Nobody in Red Creek Valley could understand why Ethan Mercer stayed. They had watched plenty of men come through the Ashford ranch over the years. Some arrived with polished boots, some with impressive reputations, and some with enough confidence to fill an entire saloon. None of them lasted. The reason was simple. Rebecca Ashford. The rancher's daughter had a reputation that stretched farther than the property fences. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't unfair. In many ways, she was one of the most capable people in the territory, but she had a way of looking at people that made them feel like they were being measured and found lacking. Most men couldn't tolerate it. The rest simply left. So when Ethan Mercer rode through the gates of Ashford Ranch on a cold September morning, nobody expected him to stay longer than a week. Especially not Rebecca. She stood on the porch of the main house with her arms folded as Ethan dismounted from his horse. The morning wind tugged at loose strands of her dark hair, but she ignored it. Everything about her posture suggested she had already made up her mind about him. Ethan noticed. He simply didn't care. He led his horse toward the stable and asked Samuel Ashford for work. Samuel Ashford was one of the largest cattle owners in the valley. For nearly 40 years, he had built his operation through droughts, harsh winters, and enough setbacks to break most men. His ranch stretched across rolling grasslands and rocky hills. His word carried weight. And lately, he needed workers. 2 experienced hands had recently left for a mining operation farther west, leaving several responsibilities uncovered before winter. Ethan arrived at exactly the right time. By midday, he had a job. Rebecca was not pleased. She found her father repairing tack in the barn later that afternoon. "You hired him already?" she asked. Samuel didn't look up. "I did. You know nothing about him. I know he wants work." Rebecca crossed her arms tighter. "And that's enough?" "It usually is." She stared at him for several seconds before turning away. Ethan happened to be stacking feed sacks nearby. He heard every word. He said nothing. That silence would become one of the most frustrating things Rebecca Ashford had ever encountered. Over the following days, Ethan settled into ranch life with surprising ease. He wasn't loud. He wasn't eager to impress anyone. He simply worked. Before sunrise, he was already moving through the barns. After sunset, he was usually finishing whatever task remained unfinished. The other ranch hands respected him quickly. Not because he talked much. Because he never asked another man to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. Rebecca noticed that too. She pretended not to. The first real clash between them came 12 days after Ethan arrived. A storm had damaged part of the western fence line during the night. Several younger hands had spent most of the morning arguing about how to repair it. By the time Rebecca rode out to inspect the damage, very little actual work had been completed. Her expression darkened immediately. "Has anyone fixed anything yet?" she asked sharply. The men became quiet. Nobody answered. Ethan was already unloading replacement posts from a wagon. Without looking up, he said calmly, "We're fixing it now." Rebecca turned toward him. "And what were you waiting for?" Ethan drove a post into the ground. "The arguing to finish." The younger ranch hands suddenly found the dirt extremely interesting. For several moments, silence stretched between them. Rebecca was accustomed to people backing down. Ethan didn't. He wasn't challenging her. He simply continued working as though the conversation had already ended. Something about that bothered her more than open disagreement ever could. Finally, she turned her horse and rode away. The younger hands waited until she disappeared over a hill. Then one of them exhaled loudly. "You got a death wish?" Ethan looked confused. "No." The man shook his head. "You'll learn." But Ethan wasn't interested in learning how to avoid Rebecca Ashford. That evening an older ranch hand named Ben Carter sat beside him during supper. Ben had worked for the Ashfords nearly 8 years. Long enough to understand things most people missed. "You know why she's like that?" Ben asked quietly. Ethan glanced up. "No." Ben stirred his coffee. "Her mother died when she was 15. Ethan remained silent. "After that, she changed." The older man stared toward the bunkhouse window. "Used to laugh all the time when she was little." Ethan looked down at his cup. "How long ago?" 12 years. The answer settled heavily between them. Outside, the wind moved across the valley, carrying the first hints of approaching winter. Ethan sat quietly for a long moment. He thought about losing someone important at that age. He thought about what grief could build inside a person when it stayed too long. And he wondered how many walls a person could construct before they forgot what existed behind them. Later that night, lying awake in the bunkhouse, Ethan stared at the ceiling. The sounds of sleeping men surrounded him. Yet his thoughts remained elsewhere. On a woman standing on a porch. On the sharpness in her voice. On the loneliness hidden underneath it. He wasn't trying to understand Rebecca Ashford. At least that was what he told himself. But somewhere between the damaged fence and Ben Carter's quiet explanation, something had shifted. Only slightly. Just enough to matter. And in Ethan Mercer's experience, the smallest changes were often where the biggest stories began. The biggest stories often begin so quietly that nobody notices them at first. Winter arrived in Red Creek Valley with little warning. The warm afternoons of September disappeared. October faded quickly, and by November, the hills surrounding Ashford Ranch wore a gray, weather-beaten look that seemed to drain color from the land itself. Work changed with the season. Fences required reinforcing before heavy snow arrived. Feed supplies had to be organized. The cattle were gradually moved toward lower grazing areas where the grass lasted longer. It was demanding work. The kind of work that revealed a person's character without asking permission. And Ethan Mercer moved through it with the same steady reliability he brought to everything else. He never rushed. Never complained. Never sought praise. Samuel Ashford noticed. The older rancher had spent decades judging men, and experience had taught him that a person's true nature usually revealed itself during difficult seasons. Ethan passed every test without seeming aware there was one. Soon Samuel began finding reasons to work alongside him. Checking feed inventories. Inspecting water sources. Repairing gates. None of these tasks required two men, yet somehow they often ended up doing them together. Ethan understood what was happening. Samuel was measuring him, not as an employee, as a person. The ranch hand never mentioned it, and Samuel respected him for that. Rebecca noticed the growing friendship between her father and Ethan. She disliked it immediately, not because Ethan had done anything wrong. That was the problem. The category she had assigned him when he arrived no longer fit. For years she had organized people into simple groups. Useful, temporary, trustworthy, untrustworthy. Most people revealed themselves quickly. Ethan refused to cooperate with the system. The longer he stayed, the harder he became to define. That irritated her more than she cared to admit. Then December arrived, and everything changed because of a horse. The horse's name was Dakota, a chestnut mare Rebecca had raised from a colt. The animal was stubborn, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. In many ways, it reminded people of Rebecca herself. One freezing morning Dakota injured her shoulder after slipping near a rocky slope north of the barn. The ranch veterinarian was unavailable until the following day. Rebecca spent most of the morning inside the stable examining the injury. The other ranch hands stayed clear. Everyone knew how protective she was of the mare. Ethan arrived shortly after noon. He stepped into the stall, assessed the situation, and quietly began helping. He didn't offer advice. He didn't try taking control. He simply assisted whenever Rebecca needed another set of hands. Hour after hour they worked together, wrapping the injury, keeping the horse calm, monitoring swelling, speaking only when necessary. The silence between them felt different than usual. Not hostile, not comfortable either. Something in between. By evening Dakota was resting easier. The injury wasn't serious, just painful. Rebecca finally sat against the wooden stall wall, exhausted. For the first time all day she looked directly at Ethan. Not through him. Not past him. At him. "You've handled injured horses before." It wasn't a question. "A few times," Ethan replied. She nodded. For a moment her guard lowered. Only slightly. But Ethan saw it. The woman who appeared beneath the armor looked tired. Lonely. Human. Then, just as quickly the walls returned. Rebecca stood, brushed straw from her coat, and walked out without another word. Ethan watched her leave. then continued cleaning equipment as if nothing unusual had happened. A few minutes later Ben Carter appeared in the stable doorway. The older ranch hand grinned knowingly. "You know most men would have taken that as progress." Ethan continued stacking supplies. "Progress toward what?" Ben laughed. "You're either the smartest man I've ever met or the slowest." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe both." The older man shook his head and left. But later that night, Ethan found himself thinking about Rebecca again. Not about her sharp words. Not about her reputation. About the expression she'd worn while caring for Dakota. The gentleness. The patience. The concern she worked so hard to hide from everyone else. People didn't invent kindness like that. Came from somewhere. A week later, Samuel Ashford invited Ethan to sit with him on the front porch after supper. The sky was clear. Stars stretched endlessly above the valley. For several minutes neither man spoke. Then Samuel finally broke the silence. "She wasn't always like this." Ethan already knew who he meant. "Ben told me about her mother." Samuel nodded slowly. "Mary was the heart of this ranch." His voice softened. "Rebecca was just like her when she was young." The old rancher stared into the darkness. Always smiling. Always talking. Something sad moved across his expression. Then life got complicated. Ethan waited. Samuel seemed to consider saying more. Instead he shook his head. Some stories were not his to tell. After another moment he spoke again. "There's still goodness in her." "I know," Ethan said quietly. Samuel looked surprised. "Most people don't." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "They stopped looking too early." For several seconds the older rancher studied him. Then he nodded. A small movement, but a meaningful one. The conversation ended there. Yet as Ethan walked back toward the bunkhouse, he had the strange feeling that something important had happened. Not because secrets had been revealed. Because trust had. Inside the main house, a lantern moved from one upstairs window to another. Rebecca making her nightly rounds. Checking locks. Checking accounts. Checking everything. Always carrying responsibilities that seemed heavier than anyone realized. Ethan watched the light disappear. Then continued toward the bunkhouse. Unaware that before winter ended, circumstances would force Rebecca Ashford to rely on him in a way she never expected. And once that happened, neither of their lives would remain quite the same. Neither of their lives would remain quite the same. February settled over Red Creek Valley with a deep, stubborn cold. The ranch moved at a slower pace now. Most of the heavy winter preparations had been completed, and the hands spent their days maintaining equipment, checking livestock, and handling the endless small tasks that kept a ranch functioning. It was the quietest time of year. And in that quiet, things people had spent months avoiding often found a way to surface. Rebecca Ashford continued speaking to Ethan more frequently. Nothing dramatic. A question about feed inventory. A discussion about grazing conditions. An observation about a fence line. Small conversations. Ordinary conversations. Yet everyone on the ranch noticed. Especially Ben Carter. One afternoon he watched Rebecca and Ethan discussing cattle records near the barn. When Rebecca finally walked away, Ben shook his head. "You know," he said, "I've worked here 8 years." Ethan continued repairing a saddle. "And I've never seen her stand and talk to somebody that long unless she was telling them they were wrong." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe she was." Ben laughed. "Son, if she thought you were wrong, you'd know it." For perhaps the first time in many years, Rebecca was beginning to feel something she didn't entirely recognize. Comfort. Not excitement. Not romance. Something deeper. The simple comfort of another person's presence. That realization frightened her more than she cared to admit. Because comfort required trust. And trust had cost her dearly once before. The moment everything finally changed came late one snowy morning. Rebecca had ridden north to inspect a remote section of fencing near the ridge. She often rode alone despite her father's objections. The habit had become second nature over the years. The trail looked safe. It wasn't. Fresh snow concealed a layer of ice beneath. Halfway across a narrow slope, Dakota lost her footing. The mare recovered quickly, but Rebecca wasn't as fortunate. She hit the ground hard and slid several yards before stopping against a cluster of rocks. Pain shot through her ankle immediately. She attempted to stand. The effort lasted 3 seconds. Then she sat back down. The ankle wasn't broken, but it was badly twisted. The nearest help was miles away. Snow continued falling. For the first time in a very long time, Rebecca found herself in a position she hated. She needed someone. Back at the ranch, Ethan noticed her absence shortly after noon. Most people wouldn't have thought much of it. Rebecca often disappeared for hours. But something felt wrong. He couldn't explain why. He simply saddled his horse and headed north. Nearly an hour later he found her sitting against a rock, trying very hard to look unaffected. The sight would have been amusing if it weren't so concerning. He dismounted calmly, looked at the ankle, looked at the slope, then looked at her. "You hurt." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "What gave it away?" Ethan nodded once. "Good." Sarcasm meant she was still herself. Without unnecessary fuss, he helped her onto his horse, collected Dakota's reins, and started back toward the ranch. Snow drifted around them. For several minutes neither spoke. Finally Rebecca broke the silence. "You didn't have to come looking." "I know." She looked ahead at the trail. "Then why did you?" Ethan considered the question. "Because the answer mattered. I pay attention." That was all he said. Yet somehow it felt like more. Rebecca stared ahead. The wind carried snow across the valley. For once she had nothing clever to say. At the ranch, Samuel Ashford met them at the gate. One glance told him everything. The injured ankle. Ethan's concern. The silence between them. Some things fathers simply know. That evening, after her ankle had been wrapped and treated, Rebecca found herself unable to sleep. For hours she sat staring at the window, thinking, remembering, questioning. Finally she stood, made 2 cups of coffee, and walked to the barn. She found Ethan exactly where she expected, checking on the horses before bed. He looked up as she entered. She handed him one of the cups, then sat beside him. For several minutes neither spoke. The barn was quiet, peaceful, safe. Eventually Rebecca asked the question she had been avoiding for months. "Why are you still here?" Ethan looked at his coffee, then at her. "I came for work." She waited, and a small smile appeared. "And somewhere along the way, I found a reason to stay." The honesty in his voice made looking away impossible. Rebecca felt every wall she had spent 12 years building begin to crack. Not collapse, just crack. Enough for light to enter. "There was someone once," she said quietly, and for the first time she told the story. About the young man who had betrayed her trust. About the humiliation. About the years spent convincing herself that vulnerability was weakness. Ethan listened, never interrupting, never judging. When she finished, silence filled the barn. Then he spoke. He was careless with something valuable. Rebecca looked down. "He made me feel foolish." "No." She looked up. "He made a foolish choice." The difference struck her harder than she expected. For years she had carried blame that never belonged to her. And somehow this quiet ranch hand had seen that immediately. Tears threatened. She laughed softly instead. "You're an unusual man, Ethan Mercer." "I've heard that before." This time she smiled. A real smile. The first one she had given him. And perhaps the first truly unguarded smile she had given anyone in years. Spring arrived slowly. The snow melted. Grass returned. Life pushed forward. And so did they. Months later, on a warm September afternoon beneath a clear western sky, Ethan Mercer and Rebecca Ashford were married on the ranch. Samuel Ashford stood proudly beside his daughter. Ben Carter pretended dust was bothering his eyes. No one believed him. Years passed. The ranch became known throughout the valley as one of the strongest operations in the territory. Ethan and Rebecca ran it together. His steady patience balancing her sharp intelligence. Not changing who she was. Simply helping her become who she had always been beneath the walls. One evening many years later, they sat together on the porch watching their children run across the yard. The setting sun painted the valley gold. Rebecca rested her head lightly against Ethan's shoulder, a gesture that once would have seemed impossible. "You never gave up," she said quietly. Ethan looked toward the horizon. "No." She smiled. "Why?" He thought about the answer, then gave the simplest one. "Because some things are worth staying for." Rebecca took his hand. The evening breeze moved softly across the ranch Samuel Ashford had spent a lifetime building. The valley stretched peacefully before them. And for the first time in many years, there was no loneliness in Rebecca Ashford's heart. Only gratitude. For the man who arrived as a stranger. Stayed when everyone expected him to leave. and patiently taught her that trust, when placed in the right hands, was never weakness at all. The sun disappeared beyond the hills, and together they watched the day end exactly where their story had begun. At home,